Joseph Stalin did not inherit a ready-made machinery of fear. He assembled it piece by piece in the unstable aftermath of revolution, civil war, and ideological exhaustion, exploiting both structural weaknesses and human anxieties within the Soviet state. After Lenin's death in 1924, the Bolshevik leadership was fragmented, and Stalin's initial power came not from charisma or military fame, but from his position as General Secretary of the Communist Party, a role that appeared bureaucratic yet granted him control over appointments, records, and internal communication. Through this apparatus, he quietly reshaped the party's composition, promoting loyalists, marginalizing rivals, and ensuring that key positions were filled by individuals whose careers depended on him. This slow institutional capture allowed Stalin to neutralize opponents not through immediate violence, but through procedural exclusion. Rivals like Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin were first isolated in debates, then removed from posts, then expelled from the party, and only later physically eliminated. Parallel to this consolidation, Stalin reframed ideological orthodoxy, presenting himself as the guardian of Leninism, while branding dissent as betrayal. Political disagreement became moral deviance, error became sabotage. The state's coercive organs, originally designed for revolutionary defense, were reoriented inward. The Cheka evolved into the GPU and later the NKVD, gaining expanded authority to arrest without judicial oversight, to interrogate, and to operate networks of informants embedded in workplaces, schools, and residential buildings. Fear was institutionalized, not merely through arrests, but through uncertainty. Laws were vague, accusations imprecise, and guilt often retroactive. The population learned that safety lay not in innocence, but in invisibility and compliance. Economic transformation intensified this atmosphere. Forced collectivization at the end of the 1920s dismantled peasant autonomy and criminalized resistance to state requisitioning. Millions were labeled kulaks, a term that ceased to describe wealth and instead became a political category signifying disposability. Deportations, famine, and labor camps followed, demonstrating that the state could erase entire communities. Industrialization through the five-year plans similarly fused production targets with political loyalty. Failure to meet quotas was interpreted as ideological sabotage. Engineers, managers, and workers were subjected to investigation for wrecking, creating a culture in which miscalculation carried existential risk. Show trials in the 1930s transformed repression into public ritual. Former revolutionary heroes confessed to improbable conspiracies in choreographed courtrooms, reinforcing the narrative that enemies were omnipresent and disguised. These spectacles served not only to eliminate rivals, but to teach society a lesson. Identity, past service, and personal integrity offered no protection. The purges extended through every layer of the state, including the military, bureaucracy, and security services themselves, ensuring that no institution could stabilize independently of Stalin's will. Terror thus became cyclical and self-renewing. Officials, fearing accusation, preemptively accused others, producing cascades of denunciation. Crucially, Stalin did not rely solely on brute force. Propaganda presented repression as vigilance and suffering as historical necessity. Education, literature, and visual culture depicted him as the paternal architect of progress, blending fear with reverence. The resulting system was not sustained by constant visible violence, but by the internalization of risk. Citizens adjusted speech, posture, and memory, learning to erase inconvenient facts even within their own minds. The unpredictability of punishment ensured obedience more effectively than continuous coercion. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had become a state in which legality was subordinate to interpretation, and interpretation to Stalin's authority. The empire of fear was therefore not merely a network of prisons and informants, but a social environment in which survival required perpetual self-surveillance, where every relationship contained potential threat, and where the future could be rewritten overnight by decree. Stalin's achievement lay not only in eliminating enemies, but in constructing a political reality in which opposition became unthinkable, not because it was impossible, but because it was psychologically unsustainable. The consolidation of Stalin's fear-based order after the initial purges relied on transforming terror from an episodic instrument into a permanent condition of governance, embedded in everyday life and reproduced through routine administration rather than extraordinary crisis. The legal framework of the Soviet Union was reconfigured so that repression appeared procedural. Decrees expanded the definition of counter-revolutionary activity to include rumor spreading, tardiness, or association with suspect individuals, while extrajudicial bodies, such as NKVD troikas, were empowered to issue sentences without defense, evidence standards, or appeal. This juridical erosion blurred the boundary between law and violence, making arrest a bureaucratic outcome rather than a dramatic rupture. Quotas for arrests and executions, issued during the Great Terror of 1937–1938, converted suspicion into a numerical target, compelling local officials to fabricate cases in order to fulfill centrally mandated figures. The system rewarded zeal. Promotions followed those who uncovered plots, while hesitation itself became grounds for accusation. As a result, the machinery of repression acquired momentum independent of specific threats, generating enemies because it was structurally required to do so. Labor camps within the Gulag network expanded in tandem, serving both punitive and economic functions. Prisoners became a disposable workforce deployed to mines, forests, and infrastructure projects in inhospitable regions, reinforcing the message that the state could extract value even from condemned lives. The camp system also externalized fear geographically. Vast territories were known primarily as zones of disappearance, places where people were sent and rarely returned, shaping collective imagination through absence. Surveillance penetrated domestic space through communal apartments, workplace committees, and youth organizations, transforming neighbors and colleagues into potential witnesses. Denunciation became a social currency, encouraged by propaganda that framed reporting as civic duty. The unpredictability of criteria, where past loyalty, wartime service, or revolutionary credentials could abruptly be reinterpreted as evidence of hidden treason undermined the stability of identity itself. Memory became hazardous. Individuals learned to disown biographies, to sever links to arrested relatives, and to rewrite personal histories in accordance with shifting political narratives. The cult of Stalin provided symbolic coherence to this unstable environment. Official media portrayed him as omniscient and benevolent, a figure whose authority derived from historical inevitability rather than human agency. This representation did not eliminate fear, it redirected it, suggesting that terror emanated from impersonal necessity rather than personal will. By framing repression as defense against invisible conspiracies, the regime normalized emergency as permanence. Even after the peak of mass purges subsided, the infrastructure remained intact. Secret files, informant networks, camp administrations, and elastic laws continued to regulate behavior. The experience of arbitrary punishment altered social rhythms. People avoided initiative, minimized visibility, and internalized caution as instinct. Trust eroded not only between citizens and the state, but among individuals, fragmenting collective capacity for resistance. Stalin's system thus achieved durability not through continuous spectacle, but through habituation. Fear ceased to be extraordinary and became atmospheric, an assumed property of existence. Power was exercised less through constant intervention than through the awareness that intervention could occur at any moment. In this environment, obedience was not merely strategic, but reflexive, embedded in language, gesture, and silence. The empire of fear endured because it was reproduced by ordinary actions, forms filled, conversations withheld, names erased, until repression no longer required direct command. Only the maintenance of conditions in which everyone understood the cost of deviation. The final stabilization of Stalin's fear empire occurred during and after the Second World War, when the regime fused patriotic mobilization with the existing architecture of repression, ensuring that victory did not relax control, but instead legitimized its permanence. Wartime emergency expanded the state's reach into movement, labor, and expression. Entire populations, Volga, Germans, Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and others were collectively accused of disloyalty and deported en masse, demonstrating that punishment could be ethnically and territorially absolute. These operations were executed with logistical precision, reinforcing the lesson that belonging itself was conditional. Soldiers who survived German captivity were screened as potential traitors upon return, and many were sent to camps, signaling that even endurance in war did not guarantee reintegration. The boundary between heroism and suspicion remained fluid, preventing the emergence of independent prestige that could rival the center. Post-war reconstruction preserved emergency norms, labor discipline laws, criminalized absence and tardiness, and cultural production was narrowed by campaigns against cosmopolitanism, formalism, and bourgeois influence. Intellectual life was reshaped to operate within rigid ideological corridors. Deviation, even aesthetic, could be recoded as political hostility. The security apparatus refined its methods, relying less on mass chaos and more on targeted pressure, selective arrests, and the persistent presence of secret files. Individuals lived with the knowledge that personal archives, letters, remarks, associations were stored beyond their reach, available for future reinterpretation. This archival power extended fear temporally. The past could be activated at any moment. The party itself was governed through controlled insecurity, with cadres rotated, demoted, or investigated unpredictably, preventing the formation of durable networks. Even those closest to Stalin experienced vulnerability, as evidenced by purges within the security services and the disappearance of long-standing collaborators. The system thus avoided institutional autonomy by keeping every layer contingent. At the same time, material advancement, housing, education, career was distributed through party channels, binding survival and aspiration to conformity. Fear was paired with dependency. Citizens learned that safety, status, and even family stability were mediated by political alignment, encouraging self-regulation more efficiently than overt force. By the early 1950s, repression had become anticipatory rather than reactive. The population acted under the assumption of observation. Language itself was disciplined. Euphemism replaced clarity. Silence replaced dissent, and official formulas replaced personal judgment. The empire of fear did not require constant terror because it had re-engineered expectations of reality. Authority no longer needed to prove its power through spectacle. It resided in the shared understanding that outcomes were arbitrary and irreversible. Stalin's system thus achieved a form of negative equilibrium, stability derived not from consent, but from the normalization of risk. When he died in 1953, the machinery remained intact, revealing that the true structure of his rule was not a single man's cruelty, but a political environment engineered to convert uncertainty into obedience, to transform society into a field of managed vulnerability, where survival itself depended on anticipating invisible boundaries. What ultimately distinguished Stalin's construction of a fear-based state from earlier authoritarian systems was the fusion of ideological absolutism with administrative routine, producing a form of domination that operated continuously without requiring permanent crisis. The regime did not merely punish acts, it redefined reality so that intent, thought, and potential became governable categories. The concept of objective guilt allowed individuals to be condemned not for what they had done, but for what they represented in an evolving political narrative. A person could become dangerous retroactively, as shifts in doctrine transformed yesterday's orthodoxy into today's heresy. This temporal instability ensured that no behavior could be permanently safe. Bureaucratic record-keeping personnel files, party questionnaires, autobiographies repeatedly rewritten, created a parallel biography for each citizen, one that could be revised independently of lived experience. Control over these records granted the state power over identity itself. Individuals learned that truth was not what occurred, but what was documented. This archival sovereignty extended into family life. Relatives of the arrested were marked, restricted in education and employment, and often compelled to renounce personal bonds. The result was the politicization of intimacy, where loyalty to kin could be reframed as complicity. The regime's capacity to isolate people socially magnified fear beyond the individual, embedding it within networks of dependency and care. The language of class and enemy was simplified into moral binaries, reducing complex social processes to deliberate hostility. Accidents became crimes. Shortages became sabotage. Disagreement became treason. Such semantic compression made repression legible and transmissible, allowing ordinary administrators to enact terror without perceiving themselves as agents of cruelty. The state thus distributed coercion across thousands of desks, stamps, and signatures. Violence became procedural. This diffusion prevented accountability from concentrating and insulated the center from direct association with suffering. Stalin's authority functioned as an abstract horizon rather than a constant command. His name was invoked to justify outcomes already produced by institutional momentum. Fear, in this configuration, did not rely on constant awareness of a ruler's will, but on the recognition that no appeal could escape the system's logic. The absence of independent courts, free press, or autonomous organizations eliminated alternative interpretations of events. Reality became monologic. In such an environment, even rumors of repression were sufficient to regulate behavior. The imagination completed what surveillance could not. People avoided speaking not because they were always watched, but because they could never know when they were. This epistemic uncertainty was more effective than total visibility. Over time, citizens internalized the regime's categories, learning to anticipate danger through self-censorship and emotional restraint. The empire of fear thus migrated inward, transforming external constraint into psychological structure. By converting unpredictability into a governing principle, Stalin's system ensured that obedience did not depend on belief or enthusiasm. It depended on the continuous adjustment of life to invisible limits. The result was a society in which conformity emerged not from persuasion, but from the learned management of vulnerability, where survival itself became a political practice shaped by the permanent possibility of erasure. The endurance of Stalin's fear empire rested on its capacity to reproduce itself across generations, embedding caution into socialization and transforming historical rupture into inherited habit. Children were inducted through youth organizations that taught vigilance as virtue and framed obedience as moral clarity. Stories of traitors and heroes simplified the world into categories that aligned ethics with compliance. Education emphasized not inquiry, but correctness, conditioning students to search for sanctioned answers rather than independent judgment. This pedagogical environment trained individuals to monitor themselves before being monitored by others. In workplaces, meetings ritualized conformity through collective affirmations, scripted criticism, and staged self-confessions, converting participation into performance. These rituals normalized exposure. Individuals learned to present inner life as legible to authority. The boundary between public and private eroded. Even emotion became regulated, as grief for arrested relatives could be interpreted as political sympathy. Silence acquired social meaning, and restraint became evidence of loyalty. The state's control over mobility through internal passports, residence permits, and labor assignments anchored fear spatially, limiting the ability to escape both physically and socially. Life trajectories were constrained by opaque evaluations that linked opportunity to political reliability, encouraging strategic alignment from adolescence onward. Importantly, repression was not uniform. It was distributed unevenly, creating gradients of risk that encouraged comparison and competition. Survival was experienced as relative advantage. Those spared interpreted endurance as proof of prudence, reinforcing adaptive behavior. Periodic campaigns reactivated uncertainty, reminding society that stability was provisional. Even in intervals of reduced violence, memory of prior purges preserved the lesson. The past functioned as warning. This temporal layering allowed the regime to govern with fewer arrests while maintaining behavioral conformity. The fear empire thus matured from an apparatus of mass destruction into a calibrated environment of constraint. It no longer needed to demonstrate power continuously. It only needed to remain credible. Credibility was sustained through archives, rumor, and precedent. Every disappearance became a reference point. Every biography contained a latent vulnerability. In this configuration, resistance required not only courage, but epistemic rupture, the ability to imagine a world where rules were stable and truth was independent of authority. The system worked precisely by preventing such imagination from consolidating. By shaping perception, memory, and expectation, Stalin's order transformed terror from event into condition. Power resided not merely in prisons or decrees, but in the shared understanding that life unfolded under reversible meanings, that safety was temporary, and that existence itself could be administratively withdrawn. The empire of fear was therefore complete, not when violence peaked, but when society learned to live as though it might return at any moment. At its deepest level, Stalin's fear empire functioned as a re-engineering of time itself, collapsing the distinction between past, present, and future into a single field of political exposure. Because guilt could be reassigned retroactively, the past ceased to be fixed. Because denunciation could emerge without warning, the present became unstable. Because opportunity depended on loyalty, the future became conditional. Life unfolded under the assumption that meaning could be reversed. Words spoken years earlier, friendships formed in youth, or positions once encouraged by the state could be reinterpreted as hostile acts. This temporal fluidity immobilized agency. Long-term planning lost coherence, and individuals oriented themselves toward immediate survival rather than collective horizon. The state monopolized continuity. History itself was rewritten, with photographs altered, names erased from encyclopedias, and textbooks revised, demonstrating that even memory was administratively governed. This was not merely symbolic. By controlling narrative, the regime eliminated external reference points that might stabilize judgment. If yesterday's hero could vanish without trace, then reality itself was contingent. The effect was cumulative. Society learned that coherence was dangerous. Ambiguity became protective. People adopted neutral language, avoided definitive positions, and reduced expressive range. Emotional compression mirrored political compression. In such an environment, the absence of protest did not indicate agreement. It reflected the internalization of risk as a primary condition of existence. Stalin's rule did not depend on universal belief in ideology, but on universal awareness of vulnerability. The fear empire achieved completeness when coercion no longer required constant activation, when individuals regulated themselves in anticipation of invisible thresholds. The system endured because it trained its subjects to participate in their own containment. Power became ambient. By the time of Stalin's death, the architecture of control extended beyond institutions into reflex, beyond law into habit. What he built was not only a state that punished, but a society that expected to be punished, a political order in which obedience emerged from the learned management of uncertainty. The empire of fear thus existed not only in prisons, files, and decrees, but in the ordinary rhythms of life, where every silence, every cautious phrase, and every rewritten memory testified to a world in which survival itself had become a function of power. The structural legacy of Stalin's system demonstrates that the fear empire was not an accidental byproduct of personal cruelty, but a deliberately engineered mode of governance rooted in institutions, procedures, and social conditioning. Its durability lay in the alignment of ideology with administration. Political categories were embedded into cadre de la, personnel files, housing registries, labor records, and educational evaluations, ensuring that political meaning accompanied individuals through every stage of life. The state did not merely observe, it annotated existence. Every application, questionnaire, and autobiography required citizens to narrate themselves in approved language, converting self-description into an act of political compliance. Deviations were archived, not forgotten. This bureaucratic omnipresence replaced episodic repression with continuous exposure. Even when arrests declined after the Great Terror, the infrastructure of fear remained operational, preserving the capacity for immediate escalation. The regime's ability to reactivate terror without rebuilding its tools testified to the system's completeness. International isolation further reinforced this environment by limiting comparative frames of reference. Alternative political realities were inaccessible, allowing internal narratives to function without challenge. War, reconstruction, and ideological campaigns supplied recurring justification for exceptional measures, preventing normalization in the liberal sense. The absence of independent civil institutions, churches, unions, courts, press, eliminated mediating spaces where collective trust could form. Society existed in direct relation to power. Under these conditions, obedience was not enforced solely by threat of punishment, but by the structural impossibility of security outside state alignment. Stalin's empire of fear thus represented a transformation of governance from episodic coercion into environmental control. It produced a political climate in which uncertainty replaced law, anticipation replaced protest, and survival replaced participation. By converting vulnerability into a permanent condition, the system ensured that power was experienced not only in moments of repression, but in the continuous adjustment of everyday life. What emerged was a form of rule in which terror became ordinary, legality became interpretive, and reality itself remained contingent upon authority. The completion of Stalin's fear empire can be measured by the way it dissolved the boundary between governance and existence, turning political power into an ambient condition rather than a visible force. By the early 1950s, repression no longer required mass campaigns to sustain obedience. Its credibility was preserved by memory, infrastructure, and precedent. Every citizen knew that arrest could occur without explanation, that legality could be suspended without notice, and that biography itself could become evidence. This knowledge functioned as a permanent regulator of behavior. The state's monopoly over employment, housing, education, and movement fused material survival with political reliability, ensuring that conformity was not merely prudent but necessary. Even the retreat from peak terror did not restore security, because the rules governing safety remained undefined. The system had taught society that stability was provisional, and that protection derived not from rights, but from alignment. In this environment, power did not need to demonstrate itself continuously. It operated through the anticipation of intervention. Silence, caution, and self-erasure became adaptive strategies. The empire of fear thus reached its final form when violence ceased to be exceptional and became implicit, when the population no longer needed to witness repression in order to act as if it were imminent. Stalin's construction endured because it reconfigured how individuals related to time, memory, language, and each other, embedding political risk into the ordinary structure of life. What emerged was a state in which obedience was not produced by persuasion, nor solely by force, but by the normalization of uncertainty. The fear empire existed wherever people edited their words before speaking, detached themselves from their own past, and treated survival as a function of invisibility. In this way, Stalin's rule transformed terror from an instrument into an environment, ensuring that power remained effective even in the absence of direct command. Viewed as a whole, Stalin's construction of a fear-based order followed a coherent trajectory: the capture of institutions, the expansion of elastic law, the conversion of ideology into a moral absolute, and the diffusion of coercion across routine administration. What began as a struggle for supremacy within a revolutionary elite evolved into a comprehensive system that governed not only action but possibility. The state learned to classify, record, and reinterpret human life, transforming biography into a political resource. Terror was standardized through quotas, normalized through procedure, and stabilized through memory. Each wave of repression taught society how to behave in the intervals between waves. The population adapted by narrowing expression, fragmenting trust, and aligning aspiration with obedience. The regime did not merely suppress opposition, it prevented its formation by eliminating the social conditions under which collective confidence could arise. By subordinating legality to interpretation and interpretation to authority, Stalin ensured that no rule could protect against power. The absence of fixed boundaries made compliance rational, and resistance existentially hazardous. When overt violence receded, its logic remained embedded in archives, habits, and expectations. The fear empire thus functioned as a self-sustaining environment, capable of contraction and expansion without structural change. Its effectiveness lay in the way it converted uncertainty into governance and vulnerability into order. Stalin did not rule solely through the capacity to punish, but through the creation of a world in which punishment was always plausible, memory was always revisable, and survival was always contingent. In that world, power no longer needed to speak loudly. It was present in every pause, every edited sentence, and every life shaped by the knowledge that reality itself could be withdrawn. The mechanism Stalin built ultimately achieved its most decisive effect not through the scale of its violence, but through the predictability of its unpredictability. The population learned that repression did not follow stable rules, that innocence did not confer protection, and that conformity offered only temporary shelter. This destroyed the logic of opposition. Political action depends on shared expectation, on the belief that others will recognize injustice, that rules can be appealed to, that outcomes are intelligible. Stalin's system eliminated these preconditions. By ensuring that meaning itself remained unstable, the regime deprived society of the cognitive tools required for collective resistance. Each individual faced power alone, armed only with caution. The destruction of autonomous institutions, the fusion of party and state, and the monopolization of information ensured that no alternative authority could emerge. Even truth became procedural, produced by confession, archive, and decree rather than evidence. Show trials did not persuade through plausibility. They demonstrated that plausibility was irrelevant. What mattered was that the state could define reality. The empire of fear was therefore not merely repressive, it was epistemic. It governed what could be known, remembered, and anticipated. Stalin's rule converted political life into a field of managed uncertainty, where survival depended on the continuous adjustment of self to invisible boundaries. By embedding vulnerability into administration, biography, and memory, the system ensured that obedience was reproduced without constant command. Terror became latent rather than spectacular, structural rather than episodic. In this configuration, power did not reside only in prisons or security services, but in the ordinary rhythms of speech, work, and thought. The fear empire endured because it taught society that safety was provisional, meaning reversible, and existence itself subject to political reinterpretation. In doing so, it transformed governance into environment and authority into atmosphere, completing a system in which domination no longer required constant enforcement, only the preservation of conditions under which every life remained permanently exposed. By the end of Stalin's life, the Soviet system had reached a state in which repression no longer depended on extraordinary mobilization, but on the continuous alignment of social behavior with political risk. The state's power rested on three interlocking capacities: to define enemies expansively, to enforce consequences arbitrarily, and to preserve the memory of both. These capacities ensured that fear was cumulative. Each arrest, each disappearance, and each rewritten biography added to a reservoir of precedent that governed future conduct. The population did not need constant reminders because history itself functioned as warning. The past was visible in absences, in empty apartments, in erased names, in broken family lines. These traces instructed without speech. The regime's success lay in its ability to convert trauma into structure. What had once been emergency became routine. What had been extraordinary became expected. Institutions were designed to operate under conditions of interpretive freedom, where officials could translate ordinary behavior into political threat. This discretionary power, distributed across thousands of offices, ensured that fear was not centralized but ubiquitous. Responsibility dissolved into process. No single act appeared decisive, yet the aggregate effect was total. The system governed not by continuous command, but by maintaining a field in which every action carried latent political meaning. Stalin's empire of fear was therefore complete not when the camps were fullest or the executions most frequent, but when society learned to regulate itself in anticipation of invisible judgment. The architecture he created did not require his presence to function. It required only the preservation of uncertainty. In that environment, obedience was not a response to ideology, nor solely to violence, but to the permanent possibility of erasure. The state had achieved a form of power in which domination was reproduced by ordinary life itself, where survival depended on adapting to a world in which law, memory, and identity remained perpetually provisional. The ultimate significance of Stalin's fear empire lies in how completely it redefined the relationship between the individual and power. Governance ceased to be a system of rules applied to citizens and became an environment within which existence itself unfolded. The state no longer merely acted upon people. It shaped the conditions under which people could imagine acting at all. By monopolizing interpretation of law, of history, of intention, it rendered every life legible only through political categories. The citizen did not confront authority episodically. Authority permeated the background of every decision. Ordinary acts, choosing words, forming friendships, recalling the past acquired political weight. The boundary between survival and compliance dissolved. What distinguished this order was not only its capacity to punish, but its capacity to make punishment plausible at all times. The knowledge that meaning could be reversed, that innocence could be recoded as guilt, and that protection had no fixed source produced a society oriented toward self-limitation. This orientation did not require constant enforcement. It was sustained by memory, rumor, archive, and precedent. Even in the absence of immediate threat, people behaved as if threat were imminent. In this way, terror outlived terror. Stalin's construction endured because it transformed fear from an event into a condition, from an instrument into a climate. The empire he built did not depend on perpetual violence, but on the internalization of uncertainty as a fact of life. Power became effective not through visibility, but through anticipation. By engineering a world in which every life remained potentially misaligned, he created a system in which obedience was not demanded, it was learned. In its mature form, Stalin's fear empire functioned as a closed circuit in which power, memory, and survival continuously reinforced one another, eliminating the possibility of a stable exterior. The regime no longer required mass enthusiasm or even ideological conviction. It required only that individuals behave as though the boundaries of the permissible were unknowable and subject to sudden revision. This condition transformed political life into a domain of perpetual anticipation. Every gesture was calibrated against invisible thresholds. People did not ask what was true, but what was safe. This distinction mattered more than belief. The system's genius lay in how it displaced causality. Outcomes were no longer the result of transparent rules, but of opaque interpretation. When arrest followed, it appeared both arbitrary and inevitable. This paradox, unpredictability within inevitability, disciplined behavior more effectively than consistent repression. Citizens learned that neither merit nor loyalty could guarantee protection, yet that misalignment could be fatal. The rational response was self-erasure. Initiative diminished, speech flattened, and social bonds thinned. The absence of trust was not accidental, it was functional. Collective action requires shared confidence in rules and outcomes. Stalin's order destroyed that confidence by making every person a potential exception. Institutions mirrored this logic. Ministries, factories, schools, and cultural bodies operated under shifting directives that could be retroactively condemned. Officials survived by demonstrating vigilance, which often meant producing enemies. Thus, the system generated the very threats it claimed to suppress. Repression became recursive. The search for danger created danger. The security organs were both instrument and model, but the same structure extended into civilian life. Committees evaluated behavior. Neighbors observed neighbors. Colleagues monitored tone and hesitation. Yet even this diffusion did not eliminate anxiety, because no level of conformity was final. Files accumulated. Biographies thickened with annotations. The past remained active. A statement made under one campaign could be revived under another. History itself was volatile. Photographs changed, textbooks shifted, and names vanished, teaching society that reality was not cumulative but corrigible. This did not merely falsify memory, it destabilized the concept of permanence. Without permanence, there could be no secure identity. People learned to detach from earlier versions of themselves, to treat life as a series of provisional alignments. The fear empire thus colonized interiority. It did not simply restrict what could be done, it reshaped what could be imagined. To think beyond the sanctioned horizon required confidence in continuity, the belief that tomorrow would recognize today's meaning. Stalin's system removed that guarantee. The future was not an extension of the present, but a reinterpretation of it. Under such conditions, resistance became cognitively implausible. One could not organize against rules that did not exist. One could not appeal to law that changed after the fact. One could not trust allies who might disappear overnight. Power no longer confronted opposition. It dissolved the preconditions of opposition. By aligning material survival with political legibility, the regime ensured that life itself became conditional. Housing, education, employment, and mobility were mediated by assessments of reliability that were neither transparent nor stable. Dependency replaced rights. The citizen's relationship to the state resembled exposure rather than membership. In this world, fear was not episodic, but structural. It did not arrive. It was always present, embedded in the ordinary management of existence. Stalin's empire of fear therefore represented a transformation in the nature of rule. It was not simply a dictatorship that punished. It was an environment that trained. It converted unpredictability into a governing principle and vulnerability into social order. The result was a society in which obedience did not arise from persuasion nor even from constant violence, but from the learned management of a reality in which meaning, memory, and survival remained permanently contingent. The final consolidation of this environment revealed that Stalin's power did not depend on perpetual escalation, but on the preservation of asymmetry between authority and subject. The state possessed the exclusive capacity to interpret, while individuals possessed only the capacity to adapt. This asymmetry structured every interaction. Orders did not need to be explicit. Their potential existence was sufficient. The absence of clear limits meant that every boundary was provisional. What was permissible today might be condemned tomorrow, and the lack of transition between the two ensured that caution replaced expectation. The population ceased to orient itself toward norms, and instead oriented itself toward signals, tone, rumor, precedent, omission. Life became semiotic. Meaning was inferred rather than known. This interpretive labor consumed social energy, diverting it from coordination and critique. The system thereby achieved negative productivity. It generated compliance by exhausting the cognitive resources required for dissent. Even language adjusted. Public speech adopted formulaic structures that minimized exposure, while private speech shrank into ellipsis and implication. People learned to speak in ways that left no trace. Silence became a form of competence. The empire of fear thus produced not only obedience, but a specific type of subject, one skilled in ambiguity, practiced in self-correction, oriented toward survival rather than assertion. This subject was not created by ideology alone, nor by terror alone, but by the convergence of both within administrative routine. Files, quotas, campaigns, and rituals operated together to make political vulnerability continuous. The absence of an external vantage point, no independent press, no autonomous court, no unregulated association ensured that this condition could not be collectively named. Experience remained private even when shared. Each person encountered power individually, even in crowds. The state did not need to fragment society. It only needed to prevent the emergence of a stable, common world. By monopolizing interpretation, it ensured that reality itself could not be publicly fixed. Under these conditions, obedience became the default not because it was morally compelling, but because it was existentially efficient. To live was to adjust. To adjust was to survive. Stalin's fear empire thus achieved a form of completeness in which domination no longer required continuous demonstration. It resided in the background assumptions of life, that safety was temporary, that truth was revisable, that identity was contingent, and that the future could not be trusted to preserve the present. In this world, power did not merely constrain action, it shaped perception. It did not merely punish deviation, it made deviation cognitively hazardous. The empire endured because it taught society to experience uncertainty as normal and exposure as permanent, transforming fear from a reaction into a condition of being. What made Stalin's system uniquely resilient was its capacity to operate without requiring belief, loyalty, or even ideological enthusiasm. It did not depend on convincing people that it was just. It depended on convincing them that it was inescapable. This distinction is crucial. Many authoritarian regimes collapse when their narratives fail, when citizens cease to believe. Stalin's fear empire was insulated against such erosion because it was structured around behavior rather than conviction. One could privately doubt everything and still function within it, provided one behaved correctly. The system did not demand faith, it demanded alignment. And alignment was measured not by inner states, but by outward patterns, attendance, language, associations, tone, biography. This behavioral focus made domination scalable. Millions could be governed without the need to penetrate conscience. The state required only that individuals adapt their conduct to uncertainty. In this sense, terror was not primarily expressive. It did not exist to send moral messages. It existed to produce habits. Arrests, purges, deportations, and trials taught society how to live in the intervals between them. Each wave of repression redefined the perimeter of safety, and each retreat preserved the lesson. The absence of closure ensured that fear accumulated rather than dissipated. Trauma became historical memory, and historical memory became structure. The architecture of this order was visible in the way even success became dangerous. Advancement attracted scrutiny. Distinction generated risk. Those who rose quickly could fall abruptly, and often did. This inverted the usual relationship between effort and reward. Instead of encouraging initiative, the system encouraged caution. Ambition was tempered by concealment. Excellence had to be modest, visibility managed. The regime thereby neutralized the formation of alternative centers of prestige. No figure could become indispensable. Even generals, scientists, writers, and security chiefs remained provisional. Their survival depended on remaining interpretable as loyal. This interpretability was never permanent. It had to be renewed continuously through gestures of conformity. The result was a political environment in which stability derived from the absence of independent authority. Power flowed downward but never consolidated horizontally. This configuration reshaped social time. In societies governed by law, the future is an extension of the present. Plans assume continuity. In Stalin's order, the future was a zone of reinterpretation. Long-term projects were undertaken, but always under the assumption that their meaning could change. A factory built under one plan might become evidence of sabotage under another. A book praised today could be banned tomorrow. A friendship formed in youth could later be classified as association with an enemy. This temporal volatility discouraged durable commitments. People learned to live in segments, to separate life into eras that could be disowned if necessary. Continuity became hazardous. The self was fragmented into versions that could be abandoned. Such fragmentation weakened the capacity for moral accumulation. Responsibility was localized. One survived by limiting the scope of one's identity.